What exactly did Jesus mean when he said, "If you love me, keep my commands"? What exact commands is Jesus really referring to in this passage of scripture?
So what exact commands was Jesus referring to in John 14, verse 15, where Jesus said to his disciples, "If you love me, keep my commandments"? So what commandments was Jesus referring to? Was he referring to the 10 commandments, which includes the 4th commandment that says, "Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy"? Was Jesus referring to this or not? That is the question in this video.
Okay, so this is one of those scriptures that is highly misunderstood, and it's also one of the scriptures that many Seventh-day Adventists will use to try to instill fear in people that if they do not keep all of the commandments, including the 4th commandment to obey and observe the Sabbath, then they must not love the Lord, and ultimately they may not actually get to heaven.
Seventh-day Adventists do not use this text to instill fear on others, sort of like to force them into keeping the Sabbath. We use this text to show that commandment keeping is a result of loving God, a love relationship.
If we go to Matthew chapter 22, Jesus does give us a better understanding of what he expects of us in terms of obeying his commandments. Notice it says here in Matthew 22, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" So you have these Pharisees who obviously were experts in the law, and they were basically trying to get Jesus to choose which is the greatest commandment in all of the Mosaic law, right? Now, I want you to notice Jesus' response here. Notice Jesus does not give them the 10 commandments as a list. He does not point out the Sabbath day or any of those things. He says this: Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." Notice now he says, all the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. So he says, you know what? Here's the only 2 commandments I'm going to give you. I'm not going to give you 600 and some commandments from the Old Testament law.
But those 2 commandments that Jesus mentioned in Matthew 22, to love the Lord with all your heart, your soul, your might, and love your neighbors as yourself, those 2 commandments came from the Old Testament. They are not new commandments. Those are Old Testament commandments from the Old Testament law. Matthew 20, where it says, "Love the Lord with all your heart," Jesus was quoting Deuteronomy chapter 6. It came from the Shema. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one." And then on verse 5, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5, it says, "Love the Lord with all your heart, all your soul, all your might." And then the second commandment that says, "Love your neighbor as yourself," Jesus was quoting Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. So these are not new commandments. Jesus was pulling out texts and passages from the Old Testament. Now you look at John chapter 14. Okay, let's go back to John chapter 14. John chapter 14, verse 15, where Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments." He is quoting again from the Old Testament. And Jesus is quoting from Exodus chapter 20. That's where you find the 10 commandments. And he's quoting from the second commandment. Look at Exodus chapter 20, verse 6. The last line there, it says that God will show mercy unto them that loves him and keep his commandments. So John chapter 14, verse 15, Jesus is quoting Old Testament, the 10 commandments. And Matthew 22, love the Lord with all your heart, is from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. And love your neighbor as yourself, you find that in Leviticus 19. verse 18. The two commandments that commands us to love the Lord with all our hearts, souls, and might, and love your neighbor as yourself, were both written at the same time when God spoke the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. These two commandments, to love the Lord with all our heart, soul, and might, and love our neighbors as ourselves, were written down by Moses. Around the same time, God wrote the Ten Commandments on tables of stone. So, is it possible that Jesus was referring to the Ten Commandments when he said, "If you love me, keep my commandments," in John 14, verse 15? It is more than likely. On another video, I'm going to show you that Jesus was actually really, referring to the Ten Commandments. So bye.